Right now, Japan is probably peak interest of all the years that I've covered it. Rise of Takaichi, the first female prime minister, already has caused massive fallout with China. So it's a fascinating moment in terms of Japanese economy, in terms of the rise of the far-right parties in Japan. There's been a lot of fear about Takaichi's spending in Japan and it pushing Japan's debt to levels where it couldn't.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, subscribing is the best way to support us. It helps us grow and bring you new stories from life in Japan. All right, let's jump in. Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and today I have the pleasure to welcome River Akira Davis on the show. Thank you so much for coming.
Great to be here.
You're a correspondent here for the New York Times in Japan, where you cover a lot of stories, primarily on business, the economy, but also energy. So we'll have a lot of interesting topics to dive into. But just before we started recording, you told me that you actually had an interesting upbringing and background and reasons that brought you here to Japan. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about that. Like, where does your kind of connection to Japan and your desire to move here begin?
Starting from the very beginning, my father, who is Japanese, he was a salaryman in Tokyo. He was a civil engineer, and he had in Japanese, you call it the datsusara moment, where you break free of the salaryman life. So when he was 30, he decided that it just wasn't the life for him, and he didn't speak any English, but he moved to this rural town in Oregon, which is where I was born, to become an artist. And so growing up, I was living on a llama farm in Oregon where he had a studio and he makes sculptures now and he still does that today.
Wow.
So he met my mother in Oregon and I grew up in this really small town called Ashland, Oregon, which is famous pretty much only for the Shakespeare Festival.
Okay.
So half Japanese, half American, born in Oregon. And I mean, it's like 98% white in Oregon. There's hardly any Asian population or diversity in general. So when I was 15, I decided that I needed to see what was outside of Ashland. And I wanted to discover more of my kind of Japanese roots as well. So I moved to another small town in Japan called Ofuna. It's a bit south of Tokyo. And I went to public high school there and I lived with an aunt. And I was the first ever foreign student there. Spoke basic Japanese, but like really nothing to the level of being able to keep up with classes. So that was my first step into Japan.
Did you travel back and forth a little bit to Japan while growing up? Or
I spent some months of the summers every now and then in Japan.
The best months to be here in Japan when it's very hot and very humid.
Definitely. I spent a couple weeks sweating each summer. But yeah, it was kind of limited access to that area of my identity. So yeah, speaking pretty rudimentary Japanese, but really not connected or in any way kind of knowledgeable about that side of my family. So when I moved here in 15, that was absolutely kind of trial by fire. Like,
it's a big decision to make in a way at 15. And it kind of seemed like the decision came from you to want to step out of Oregon and explore something else and move to another country at 15 that maybe you have a cultural connection to, but not necessarily the language and no friends there, nothing. That's how was the experience for you?
It was definitely tough. My parents were actually quite nervous about me moving to Japan. It was the year after Fukushima.
Oh.
And so, in their heads, they were like, is Japan safe? I'm going to a high school somewhat by the ocean. So it was very much my own push that got me there. But it was difficult making friends for sure in high school, just speaking not that great Japanese. And I felt kind of like very much an oddity. I remember early on, I brought, an apple to class. And in the US, we kind of just like, eat an apple, like bite by bite. And people looked at me like I was crazy. They chop up their apples and they have toothpicks for the peeled apple slices. So I was called sort of the wild child from day one in high school.
Wild child for biting straight into the apple. But funnily, we still have that conversation today. I've had that conversation in the office here as well, surrounding how the proper way to eat an apple and what is appropriate. So that seems to still be the conversation started today. So that was kind of your trial by fire, testing out the apple in class. What were some of the things, because obviously you're still here today, that during this high school experience got you interested enough that you wanted to kind of push through and not give up, like, oh, I don't feel accepted here, I want to go back to Oregon?
I was never one to give up on anything. If I set my mind to something, I was full. I mean, I had fought my parents to get out into Japan anyway. So I was like, I must absolutely fight through, whatever comes my way. But, I started to really fall in love with Japan that year. Specifically, I had an aunt in Japan who I was living with who became like a second mother to me. And I just learned so much about sort of how they take care of each other in my family. Like, if you bring home 3 cookies, this is actually a moment that I remember, but my cousin, basically lied and said, I'm not hungry, I don't want a cookie. And then I talked to him later and it was because, there was 4 people in the family. I brought home 3 cookies. And so he had already calculated that there wouldn't be enough for everyone. So he was already from the bat, just like didn't want anyone to feel bad. And it's just this like extra step of like thinking ahead on how everyone feels in a situation that did not come at all naturally to me. So I felt very much like an outsider in that scenario. But once I started to learn that, then it was difficult for me to go back to the US and sort of have the complete opposite treatment. So it was a huge learning experience. And I mean, that definitely changed me, I think, more than probably any other year of my life.
How long did you stay here in high school?
I was there for 1.5 years. I then, I had to take my SATs and everything on the military base here. And then I went back to the US for college after being here in high school.
So it's possible to transfer, like, so to say, high school credits and still take your exam while doing that abroad, basically?
Yeah. I took my SAT on the military base. It was very stress-free, of
no
course.
No cheating there, I imagine.
No, immediate deportation.
So why not for them then go to university here in Japan? Why decide to head back to the States for college?
I wanted to pursue a career in international relations. I thought I wanted to be in the State Department and try and do some kind of diplomatic work between the US and Japan. So I ended up applying to Georgetown School of Foreign Service because that is kind of the career path to get there. That eventually turned out that was not at all the career for me, but that was my initial motivation for moving back to the US.
At what point in that kind of a college career then, so to say, or your studies, did you get interested in journalism, which is eventually the path you took?
It was totally random. I mean, people ask me why I became a journalist. Like, are you passionate about the truth, or what motivated you? And it was just one of those games where you put the coin in and then it like hits a bunch of pegs and you end up here and you're like, I don't know how I got here. But it was when I was a junior in college, I did an internship at TV Asahi. They had a small Washington, D.C. bureau. And this was during the first few months of the first Trump administration. And so it was a really interesting time to be in D.C. And, I think I was 20 at the time. But just, going to State Department briefings and interviewing people and protesters out in the streets of D.C., you just felt like, at the time, I mean, I did not know what I was doing at all. But you, as this kind of unfinished adult, were being able to stick your nose in all these places where you felt like you didn't belong. That was like very exciting and addictive from the start. So that was my first step. And then, I ended up doing mostly journalism in Japan from there. But
I'm curious about that experience because you mentioned you got to be in the briefing rooms from the State Department, such during the first Trump presidency. And nowadays, it seems like we can't see this briefing room enough on TV. It's there every single day. What is this room like as a journalist? To someone that doesn't really understand what's going on there, we sometimes see the clips of someone asking, I don't know, the press spokesperson some questions, and they are back and forth. When you're there as a journalist, do you have a sort of assignment, like you get to ask just one question, you have to use your 30 seconds wisely, or how does this all work?
There's a lot of unspoken rules in the press room. So And there's kind of a hierarchy as well. So the kind of big names in US journalism have the front seats in these State Department briefings. And at the time I was working for, TV Asahi, the Japanese news station. So I think if I had put my hand up and tried to like scream out a question, the other journalists in the crowd would have just been like,
who is she?
Who are you? Go back to the back of the room. But yeah, it's an interesting, you get to see sort of the legends of the journalism world, sitting up front. And it's definitely a stifled atmosphere. And I was, covering briefings during the Trump administration. And clearly, there's quite a at times tense relationship between Trump administration officials and the media in general. So I don't know if that was sort of the standard atmosphere of these briefings, but it was quite... It was a tense atmosphere, and you feel a sense of camaraderie, I think, with your other journalist peers in there as well, because in a way, in the name of journalism, we're all fighting for the same ultimate purpose, whether it's, on the right spectrum or the left of the spectrum. So it was an interesting experience to have as, a 20-year-old who didn't really know what she was doing.
You described it as addictive. What was the addictive part? Is it in a way every day you go into that room and you try to get your question across, you try to get the answer? Is that kind of like a game of back and forth together with the officials?
I guess it's just... the addictive part was just the fact that, for some reason, because of the organization that you work for and this little like press badge that you have, you just get access to so many areas of the world that I think are not accessible for other people. So, it's the greatest job ever because, for a curious person, if you are interested in, what is happening at this nuclear plant, for example, you can just call up an expert, the world's expert on, nuclear energy and ask them what their thoughts are on whatever you're looking into. So that kind of access to these channels of incredible people is, I think, what was interesting. And yeah, so many scenarios where you feel like you're just like a little sneaky person putting your head in somewhere where you don't belong. that is what was fun and addictive, I think, for me.
So that little internship turned into like, okay, I need to do this properly. I need to kind of go through. So you maybe readjusted your studies and you kind of graduated. And then it's like, okay, I want to be a journalist. And I think you got your start a little bit at Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal. Did you have an idea of the kind of journalism you wanted to do? Because the topics are very broad. You can cover finance, you can cover, we'll talk about it later as well, like energy, but you can be a sports journalist or there's so many areas to cover. And I imagine everyone kind of specializes in a field.
Yeah. I didn't have a particular area of journalism I was interested in, but just through a connection at the Asahi back in DC, they had another colleague that was working for the Wall Street Journal in Tokyo at the time. And so I ended up studying abroad a year in Japan in undergraduate. So I then turned the TV internship into an internship at the Wall Street Journal, which I was doing after, my undergraduate studies at Waseda. And yeah, the TV journalism was very much sort of just a fun experience. The Wall Street Journal and my boss at the time there was like who taught me journalism and how to write and how to think about stories, how to interview people. Again, it was another scenario where I came in and I spoke, good Japanese, but the Japanese that you use in interviews or in business is completely different language. So I remember, I would fall out of my seat every time the phone rang at the office because I knew I had to pick up and speak perfect Keigo, the kind of, formal Japanese. And I knew people were listening to me in the office and I was like, I hope I don't mess this up. So yeah, that was, sorry, I forgot your question.
No, kind of how you got your start.
How I got, yeah.
You said one interesting thing there that your mentor at the Wall Street Journal is really the person who taught you journalism. If you think back about those teachings and those that you keep with you today when you approach a story and when you report, what are the important things that you want to kind of make sure to convey or preserve as part of journalism?
The biggest lesson that I took away, I think, beyond sort of the craft of, how to structure a story and write with a specific tone. It was really the Wall Street Journal, I think, as an entity has such a primacy that it places on fairness. So it's, if you speak to one person that says something that is, a relatively strong statement, absolutely you include the opposite, the polar opposite of that. So making sure that there is equal amounts of, viewpoint A and viewpoint B reflected in a story. Because fundamentally, I think as journalists who are not opinion writers, we all, and especially, I firmly believe that my opinion does not belong in a story. Like, my job is to convey what all of these people who are way smarter than I am in their field have to say on a subject, and more passionate too. So it's not my job to convey or convince anyone of any certain viewpoint on an argument. It's just to simply provide facts and provide people that think one way and another way, and let people decide what they want at the end of the story. So achieving that completely 50-50 balance is obviously not possible, but like, that is the ultimate goal that I think we should be pursuing. And that's, what I learned very early on from my boss at the time.
It seems to be a goal that is even more so challenging when nowadays I feel a lot of people get their news probably from social media. And when we take, let's say, a post from the New York Times that goes out, and then we read the comments, I often see a lot of people commenting on the headline chosen, because sometimes the headline is maybe too neutral when covering, let's say, a conflict where people are strongly opinionated about. When you read those or you see this as a journalist, do you just have to put your personal beliefs aside and just saying, okay, no, my role as a journalist is just to share this, and I cannot let my work be influenced by people's maybe emotional reactions to the story?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to the headline, you're right. That is the number one complaint we get about any story generally is, the headline is clickbaity, or, doesn't convey properly what the story is trying to say. Most organizations, journalists are not actually the ones that choose the headline for their stories. It's the editors. And obviously that sounds like an excuse, but, and it's also our job as journalists, a lot of situations, to play the intermediary role between the editors that want a story conveyed in a certain way, and then, your loyalty to the people that you speak to in the story, and making sure that their message is not skewed in any way in the form of a headline. But it's always a difficult balance, and there's, always fights on different stories. At the New York Times, our audience is very heavily American and very broadly, or not broadly, it skews heavily to the left. So I think, in general, whenever we do stories, especially over the past year and a half, almost all of our coverage, even out of Japan, has been oriented around the Trump administration. But it is a lot of, anti-Trump comments. So, I'm aware of the views of our readers, and they certainly like to email in and convey their opinions as well. But, it doesn't kind of move me away from trying to keep my stories completely neutral to the extent that I can.
You mentioned that the choice of the headline is, for example, often the one of the editor, not the journalist. When we pick a story, let's say not like a first page story, just a normal story that goes into the journal, how many people work on this? Is it just one journalist doing some research, putting together drafts, sharing it with the editor, or like how many people kind of touch this before it actually goes out?
It depends on the story. If it's breaking news, something that's a really quick turnaround, it'll be, myself and then perhaps just one editor. Our editing base is in Seoul these days. So myself and one editor in Seoul. If it's a longer investigative story, you might have 3-4 editors weighing in from Seoul, New York. In Japan, it's myself and then one other correspondent, and then we have 2 researcher reporters that we work with. So it's a 4-person team out here in Japan. But in general, somewhere between 2 to 6 journalists / editors in one story, I would say, is typical.
So you already brought up a little bit now what you're doing here in Japan. We were talking about the Wall Street Journal. In between, what was the moment that you decided to take that journalistic career back to Japan and to report from here?
So after the Wall Street Journal internship, I went back to DC and I actually worked for a bit at the Japanese embassy in DC. That was my last year of university, and that was the last shot where I was like, I'm going to give this kind of diplomacy hat a real chance to kind of explore. And that very, very much was not my cup of tea. Mm-hmm. I enjoyed writing. And so I was working in the public affairs department for a bit and helping kind of formulate statements and strategies and different presentations. And I just remember writing say a product, and then the thing that comes out at the end of this tunnel of editing and sort of making sure that everything is properly vetted. It, especially in the realm of politics, is like the amount of freedom you have in terms of your own writing is just very non-existent. So that was not my cup of tea. And then after university, I knew I wanted to go back to Japan for a bit. And I think I actually really liked the idea of trying to experience multiple stages of my life in the US and Japan. So I actually came back to Japan for grad school, because I wanted to experience higher education in Japan as well. So I came back here and I did my graduate studies while working at the Wall Street Journal. So,
okay, wow. Busy years, I imagine.
I did not sleep much for quite a long time. And it took me, years and years to finish that grad degree. Like every time, I was supposed to finish it in 2 years. I think it took me like 4.5.
Wow.
And I had to keep applying for extension and coming up with like different reasons. Because, the education system in Japan is not the most sort of lenient and understanding for other circumstances. Like you're working a full-time job on top of doing, your graduate studies. So I remember one time I took an entire course and I finished it. I took the final and everything. And then I got called into the office and people said, you don't get credit for this course because you didn't check the box when you signed up for the course saying that you wanted your credits to transfer to the specific program.
Really?
And I said, I finished the whole class.
And you passed the exam.
I passed the exam. And they're like, yeah, but you didn't register properly. You didn't check the box. And I was like, that was kind of
Did you find a way to solve this, or was this the end? That was it?
That's the end. But that's, kind of Japanese schooling in a nutshell.
So you got the experience you wanted of comparing university in Japan and in the US, where these restrictions can be difficult when you try to balance a career already at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's something we encounter a lot in Japan, is like if you don't fit within the box of like, in that example, a student who is full-time student, if there's any kind of, situation or circumstance that puts you outside of that box, there's not a lot of leniency. So yeah, that was a lesson I learned, amongst other things, in grad school in Japan.
But you did end up getting all your credits and you did graduate, and then you were like, maybe now I can continue reporting from here, which you were already doing in a way.
Yeah. At the time I was working on 3-month contracts at the Journal. So every 3 months, I didn't know if I had a job the next 3 months. And every time you have to like submit the stories that you did and say, this is the reason why I should stay on.
Are these stories that are assigned to you, or is it something that you kind of pitch to them every time? Like, hey, there's this thing happening, I want to write about that.
I think I was hired essentially to help some other reporters in the office who weren't fluent in Japanese. At the time, it was the whole scandal around Carlos Ghosn, the former Nissan CEO. And so that was a massive story for the Journal. And I was doing work on that story. And then on the side, I was writing my own stories because I wanted to get my own personal byline out there. But yeah, it was every 3 months, I was fighting for my next job. And then when COVID hit, the whole Journal went on a hiring freeze. So I saw the writing on the wall, and I realized that this was a pretty tenuous position to be in, especially during a pandemic when, access to healthcare, etc. is probably pretty important.
Well, luckily, you were in Japan at the time.
Exactly.
That kind of made things a little bit better.
Yeah. And it was helpful because I was still doing my grad degree at that time. And because everything went online, I could just record all my lectures and watch them after work. But during that time, I then was offered a regular full-time position at Bloomberg. So I went there for 2 years and enjoyed not having to worry every 3 months about whether I had a job.
Do you notice, now you're at the New York Times, but do you notice a difference between how each of those institutions are kind of approaching stories, editing them, structuring them, or is it the core kind of the same?
Oh, it's leagues different. I think in general, Wall Street Journal and New York Times are more similar because they are sort of this traditional newspaper format. Although, they're increasingly trying to push us towards video and these other formats as well. But Bloomberg is definitely a different beast. We've seen across sort of traditional media headcount being cut in Japan, and a lot of people are moved to China just as the story pivoted and journalism budgets become slimmer. But Bloomberg has, they still, I think, have something like 40 journalists in Japan.
Wow.
So the level of, coverage they can push out is impressive because they have so many people and such healthy budgets because, they're selling the product, which is the terminal, which is geared towards investors. And it makes a lot of money and it funds great journalism for them. So it was interesting to be part of that because that's very different than sort of the shoestring budget newsroom that, I was more accustomed to up until that point. They have lovely sparkling offices in Marunouchi and free food and snacks.
Which probably brings up also interesting questions from a journalistic ethics perspective. I noticed that on your New York Times profile, you kind of link directly to the journal's kind of code of ethics of journalism. And it feels like it's something important that the journal has established and that it wants its journalists to maintain. But when you suddenly are in these situations where you mentioned you have to go out and get the story, and one journalist from one place has a lot of budget to take the transport, maybe to go there faster or to stay somewhere and to be able to spend the week to kind of really cover it, whereas you are like, well, I can either pitch a tent here or how does this affect the stories themselves when there are such different budgets involved into covering each of those?
I think, we're always happy. I think in general, journalists are happy to just kind of, we'll hire a bus or, hitchhike to get to a story. It's more about the general head count. So, because we have 4 people in Japan versus 40, the level of story that we can cover is quite different. So for the Times or for the Journal, we have to cover, and pivot to whatever the biggest story is at the time. Which is very different than the kind of beat reporting that you do, or that I did at Bloomberg, for example. I was covering very specifically auto companies in Japan. And so it's a different style of journalism. You build very deep sourcing in a specific area, and that is your area, and you own that area. Whereas, you write 4 or 5 stories a week on, Nissan, Toyota's share price did this, and that's the way to kind of make a name for yourself. Whereas at the Times or the Journal, you have to cover stories much more broadly and just kind of you're one human. So cover issues broadly and you can't delve as deeply into certain topics as you'd like to, or as if we had 40 people covering Japan. So that is, it's a different kind of granularity in which you can cover topics.
Did you also notice a difference between how topics were covered and approached when you were working in the States as opposed to now kind of starting to be part of these here in Japan? Does the reporting change from one country to another or stay similar because the paper is from America, so it kind of stays the same?
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that question because, I had a limited experience of sort of TV journalism in the US, but much my entire journalism career. So I did 2 years at the Journal, 2 years at Bloomberg. I went back to the Journal for 2 years after Bloomberg, and then I joined the Times, and it's been almost 2 years. I'm not planning to leave. But my entire journalism career has strangely ended up being with American institutions in Japan. So that's sort of the journalism that I know. I mean, I know working from colleagues what it's like broadly working in the US or Europe and the differences there. But for myself, yeah, my whole experience has been in Japan.
So the New York Times, now nearly 2 years as well. Was this a desire of you to kind of join the Times when the opportunity arose and to kind of, even though it's a smaller team, to be like, no, this is kind of the one that I want to be part of?
Yeah, I mean, I very much grew up with the New York Times, and it was always kind of the publication that I had dreamed to work at. And obviously, I took a meandering path to get here, but it's been really nice in the sense that in previous jobs, I had much more limitation in what I could cover and sort of what responsibility I was handed. Focusing specifically on covering autos, for example, whereas at the New York Times, I mean, it's a lot of pressure because you never know what's going to happen. You're writing about an earthquake and the Trump administration to, whatever the news of the day is. But I felt like that was the best place for me to grow as a journalist, even though it was scary. I feel a bit more comfortable these days, but yeah, the autonomy to sort of cover what stories you think are important, no matter what domain they're in, was what drew me to the New York Times here.
Earlier on, I asked you kind of if you had an idea of what kind of journalist you wanted to be. And you said at the beginning, you kind of fell into it a little bit and then you kind of got to learn and see how things are. Now that you have this experience, have you started noticing, or when have you started noticing you want to cover more of these stories because your personal interest kind of lies there?
Honestly, no.
No?
There's a weird thing where, whatever story you're writing about, you get kind of weirdly obsessed with it, and you find interest in it, whatever it is. So, I mean, this is a story I'm working on right now, but I'm doing a story on Japanese government bonds. And I mean, I would have thought, my eyes would glaze over writing a story about that previous to reporting the story out. But you find, little elements of like fascination in any story that you're writing. So I'm very open to covering, whatever is thrown at me. I mean, in the world of government bonds, the struggle, I guess, with the story was like how to make it not boring for a general reader in the US who cares about government bonds. But the angle with this story was we're talking to basically this contingent of traders because Japan hasn't had interest rates in 2 decades. And because there's been a lot of fear about Takaichi's spending in Japan and it pushing Japan's debt to levels where it couldn't, basically finance those interest costs. Yields on these Japanese bonds have been spiking. After being essentially dead for 2 decades. So there was entire days where no government bonds were traded in a day, which is absolutely ludicrous.
Like zero.
Zero, no trades. So in the story, we call it finance's most boring market for the past 2 decades. But now it's super interesting because yields are spiking because of Takaichi and her spending and the Bank of Japan raising interest rates. So anyway, the way of telling that is basically we talk to this group of traders who are from the 80s and 90s, and they're in their 60s and 70s now. They're like these kind of veteran silver-haired traders, but they're very much in demand these days after a long hibernation because they have memories of trading in days where Japan actually had interest rates. So it's this revival of like the Oji-san JGB trader. And, they have these great memories from like the 80s and 90s of these drunken cherry blossom government bond parties in Kyoto. And they have these like houseboat parties that cruise through the Sumida in Tokyo. And
I want to hear about those, even though I'm personally not that interested into Japanese government bonds. But now you sold me on that story.
Yeah.
How do you approach this if you don't necessarily have the background in a specific field? So government bonds, you have to understand how they work, what are the implications for the economy at large or on a micro level. If it's a field that you're not, let's say you didn't study economy, and you get into that, you don't necessarily have the time to study or to look at all the perspectives that you mentioned were important to share in there. How do you approach it?
that's like the scariest part is you do have to put your foot forward in a number of arenas where you're like, I don't know anything about bond. I mean, thankfully in Japan, I actually did my graduate degree in econ and finance.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did learn a bit about bonds and I mean, the way that like central banking works, for example. So that was helpful. But I mean, yeah, on a daily basis, you get thrown stuff where you're like, I mean, a big story over the past year has been Japan's interactions with China, and it comes to like rare earths, and we don't know what rare earths are and what they do inside of magnets, and constantly you get thrown different stuff that you have no idea and you've never covered before, and it's your job to be this sort of authoritative voice on this for our largely American readers who don't know what's going on in Japan. So that has always caused immense amount of anxiety for me. But I view it as like good anxiety because it forces me to like overachieve and like study and just talk to every expert that I can and I mean, at the end of the day, the way that I comfort myself is like my job is to convey the voice of like experts, not to be the expert myself necessarily, because it's not possible for me to be an expert on everything. So
how do you find all those experts? Because when you go out there and you need to write a story about I don't know, impact of China's rare earth on the Japanese economy or impact of tariffs and such, how do you know who to call to put a quote in the interview or in the article?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that you kind of just get a sense for naturally through the years. Like, I think probably in my early days in journalism, there was more instruction from my bosses of like, this is the voice you want, this is the voice you want. But once you go through that cycle enough, you kind of understand like, okay, maybe this person is good to talk to. For the rare earth story we did, I mean, basically, China has threatened to cut off much of the world from rare earths, which are these minerals that go into everything from cars to missile systems. And Japan had this interesting experience of in 2010 being cut off by China, decades before the rest of the world was because of an issue with the Senkaku Islands. And so, I mean, in general, our job out of Japan, I think as correspondents is like figuring out what the specific Japan angle is for a lot of the global stories that are happening. So rare earths have been in the news constantly, and Japan's specific kind of element that it can add to that story was just that it experienced this so much before the rest of the world and how it kind of adapted through the years to actually reduce its reliance on China quite a bit. So when I realized that Japan had this experience, then I went back and I found sort of the government officials and some of the companies that were involved back, in 2010 when this was first happening. So we reached out to one person who's at an energy think tank who used to head the kind of economy ministry push on this at the time. We interviewed the CEO of Sojitz, which is a trading house, which is, the big kind of non-China rare earths player in Japan. And so a lot of it was them talking about their experience of how it's so difficult for countries to build up their own capacity of rare earths because the processing of it is so environmentally destructive that essentially to produce them in a way that is not extremely damaging to like local communities and the environment, it costs so much money that then makes their product not competitive at all with China. And so that's really the reason why China has 90+% of the rare earth supply chain happening within China. So that was the lesson that Japan learned. And then, it's our job, I suppose, as the correspondent to like convey that perspective to the rest of the world. So when the US and Australia, France, Europe, they try and pivot away from China, then they can take that lesson that Japan had 15 years ago and try and, implement it a bit faster.
When you are working on that story and you reach out to those, you introduce yourself as a New York Times correspondent, are people generally like very welcoming to being interviewed and such, or is there like a mistrust? I know that maybe in the United States, the perspective of media and let's say these legacy outlets has shifted over time, and maybe some people have more reticence towards being interviewed and have their name associated with the story and such. How's it here in Japan?
I have sensed much more than when I was at Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal, like there is an impression of the New York Times, and there's a bit of trepidation, I would say, from more people than I've had in previous jobs, especially in the business community, because I think, when you're at Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal, they're kind of an idea that, it's your job to cover business, where sometimes when you approach businesses in Japan as a New York Times correspondent, they're like, what are you investigating us for? And I'm like, no. Like, we cover business regularly and, just like the other players. So businesses, I think, are a bit more leery at times towards the New York Times. And yeah, I think there's a level of scrutiny that the paper is given by government officials as well. So it's been more difficult, I think. I mean, there's positives, of course, in that, the paper is a big name and it's well known. But yeah, it comes with its own kind of downsides in that, there's definitely people that view the New York Times as having its own kind of agenda, or, only talking to them because they're trying to pursue some thing that they're doing wrong,
Yes, so you mentioned investigations. Investigative journalism is a whole branch on its own. I imagine very long stories in terms of the amount of research that needs to go into them. Is this something you do at all, or is this like a kind of, let's say, a different team that specializes in those and you're more focused on covering the stories that are happening now?
It's a balance that we have to do consistently. So a lot of the past year, I think, has been just us reacting to news in all foreign bureaus outside of the US to like what is being thrown. Because the beauty of the Trump administration and the news cycle is that basically when something goes out in the middle of the night in the US, which President Trump very much likes to send out social media posts at like 2 a.m, then, who is awake at that time? Asia. Okay, so we're reacting to like what is going on. But investigations are something that we pursue at the same time and kind of balancing all of that. So, I mean, I can't speak too much about it, but like one thing we're working on right now in Japan is like the Japan chunk of the Epstein files, with thousands and thousands of emails coming out, which Japanese officials are implicated in that stuff. So that's something that we're working on at the moment, on top of sort of covering, whatever daily breaking news there is.
How many stories are you working on at once, or like in parallel of each other?
It depends. I mean, usually we have like 3-4, we call them enterprise stories, which are sort of longer reporting projects in the works. And then dailies come up, just whenever they come up. So maybe we'll do 1 or 2 breaking news stories a week. And then enterprise is more like 3 a month. And then longer investigations are maybe 1 every 3 months, something like that.
You mentioned that you often have to react to things that are like happening, and we actually tried to schedule this interview sometime last year, and that was...
I'm so sorry.
No, not at all. But that was just when Donald Trump suddenly kind of came to Japan.
The day that he came to Japan,
then obviously you kind of had to cover the story, what's going on there. When an event like this happens, as a journalist, what are you doing? What are your... are you at home and you're just watching what's happening and you're relaying information, or do you have to go out and run after and try to get into one of those newsrooms that you were talking about before? What happens during that stay?
We were just talking about that we had some editors. We had the big kind of Seoul news conference, and so a lot of editors from New York came out and stopped in Japan, and we were having a conversation over dinner about how much our partners all probably hate being with journalists. Because, I mean, basically the understanding is like, if you're in a relationship with a journalist, it's like any point in time, your day could be ruined. And any vacation plan you have, any date night you plan could be ruined at any point. I can't turn my ringer off at night because if, the prime minister gets shot, or the former prime minister gets shot, as we saw with Abe, then, you have to be on that story no matter what time of day it is. So that is definitely one of the more stressful aspects of the job, especially when you're a small bureau, because, whatever news happens in Japan, that is your responsibility to cover. So yeah, reacting to that, I mean, we have sort of systems that scrape news. something called Data Miner we use a lot. It flags like local media reports or social media postings. And it's pretty good at picking up like breaking news. So, there's a fire or an accident here, or, this company just announced this thing on their website. It seems important. So we'll scan through those constantly. And yeah, when something is big enough that we need to cover it, then we just immediately get to a laptop wherever it is. So I remember, one of the fun moments last summer was there was a big earthquake and people were wondering whether it was perhaps a prelude to the big Nankai Trough earthquake that is, supposed to kill hundreds of thousands and be immensely destructive. And so I was waiting to, they had some researchers kind of holed up in this room and they were going to disclose their prediction in like an hour or two. And right when they were in the room, there was another big earthquake that happened. And I was like, oh, this is the moment. But, instead of like going and diving under a table or whatever you're supposed to do, as journalists, we're just like running for our laptops. Like, so you have to train yourself to just like run towards danger in some circumstances, which is not necessarily the normal reaction. But yeah.
You mentioned that you use tools like Data Miner to scrub all the local news and such.
Yeah.
Do you notice a big difference in how local news, or let's say Japanese papers, are covering stories that you're also covering for the New York Times?
Definitely. The big difference in Japan, I think, compared to a lot of other countries when it comes to reporting here is they have, what they call a Kisha Club.
Yeah.
I've heard about that.
But
the
essentially, the Japanese newsroom, so to say, like the club of reporters that is allowed access to listen to official speeches.
Exactly. And so, as foreign media not being allowed in those clubs, you don't receive the information that these other reporters get. And I think Japan has a diversity of papers leaning, more liberal, more conservative, everything. But at the end of the day, when you are a reporter that is in a room with 10 other domestic reporters and you get the same information, there's only certain ways that you can write that information. So you do see kind of, in some senses, a lot of the same messaging coming out across papers in Japan because they have access to this information that, we don't have. So that is a very strange system that I think a lot of people grumble about, but has shown no sign of changing. At least for now.
One of the fields you got interested into, and I want to kind of talk a little bit about that, is energy. You covered quite a few stories. A big one was happening in Alaska, I think, with liquefied natural gases being exported to Japan and such. Can you explain a little bit that story? What was important about it, and why did you get so into it?
This is actually, so I started covering Alaska LNG. Basically, it's this project that Alaska has had going on since, I think, the 80s, maybe even before that, to build this massive pipeline, across permafrost connecting the north to the south. And it costs, tens of billions of dollars. And it has never gotten off the ground for decades. And I first covered that story at the Journal because the ambassador to Japan at the time, Rahm Emanuel, was trying to really push this narrative of Japan being interested in investing in this project and getting it up off the ground because it was trying to wean itself off of Russian LNG, liquefied natural gas, the kind of liquid form of natural gas. And so we investigated that, and I talked to, every energy company in Japan. I said, "Are you interested in Alaska LNG?" And they said, no, we're not interested. There's no way this project is getting off the ground. The economics don't make sense. And so I remember I had lunch with Rahm at the time. And, we got in a bit of a battle because I was like, Rahm, there's no companies that are interested. And he's like, they exist, they exist. And I was like, name a company that is interested in this project. We'll put it in our story. He's like, I can't name names, but like they exist. And I was like, name a company. And he was like, I hear you, sweetie. And I was like, oh.
He actually said that.
Yeah. So that was an interesting meeting. Anyway, we ended up writing the story and saying that Japan is not interested in Alaska LNG. And obviously officials in Alaska and others were not very happy about that. But that's all we could do is convey the truth of like what we're hearing from Japan on the ground here. Anyway, and then, fast forward a few years, the Trump administration comes in and is in negotiations with Japan over this big trade deal. And, if Japan doesn't provide terms that Trump likes, then he's going to tariff Japan. And so one of the discussions that was brought up repeatedly was like, could Japan offer Alaska LNG investment as a way of kind of getting in President Trump's good graces? And so companies started to look at this project again, and I decided that I wanted to go out and see this place. Had never been to Alaska before. So I flew into Anchorage and then drove about 4 hours out of Anchorage to this really small town called Nikiski, Alaska, which is really interesting because it was one of the first places in the US to ever export LNG, 4 decades ago, more than that maybe, to Japan. And so they had this like weird connection with Japan that was decades old, but all of the infrastructure was aging, half the plants were closed, the town and the economy itself was really struggling, and you could see that. But then they had this kind of glimmer of hope that this massive project was again going to kind of bring industry back to Nikiski, Alaska. And so, yeah, it was fascinating to go out there and see that. And that's what's interesting about energy, I think, is like you got to just, it's such a convoluted world of like politics and money. And I mean, Japan takes its energy security very, very seriously. But yeah, the chance to see Alaska and this town, I think was definitely one of the more interesting reporting trips I took last year. One of the crazy moments from that trip was we were driving around with the mayor of this town, and basically there's a plot of land that was already dedicated and cleared for this export terminal of LNG to be built there in the future if this project gets funding. And we were driving around with the photographer, and there's a car parked in that area, and we kind of were peering around as journalists do, and it was like a mother and father, I think, in the front, and then a kid in the back, and they were smoking meth in the car. And we were with the mayor at the time, and the mayor's like, "Oh, what are they doing there?" And our photographer's like, "They're smoking meth." And the mayor's like, "Oh no, please don't write about that." So, but I mean, it was kind of a very vivid example of like how that area was struggling in a lot of ways. Poverty rates had been increasing since the gas infrastructure had aged and Japan was no longer buying LNG from the area. So, I mean, that was a pretty crazy moment, but also just insightful. That type of stuff is like, you don't see that if you're writing from your desk in Japan.
I have so many questions, but what I'm curious about is we talked earlier about keeping the balance, keeping it to the facts. When you go to a location like this, especially after having maybe talked to the companies here in Japan that we're not interested in a project whatsoever. So from a pure economical perspective here in Japan, doesn't make sense, let's not do it. But then you go to Alaska, you go to this town, you see the people there have their livelihood kind of go away because Japan is not purchasing the LNGs from there. How do you stick to the facts and not necessarily get influenced by the difficulties these families that you may have met at the time are experiencing and feel like, oh, maybe I can use my voice, I can use my pen to shine light on what's going on there, and by bringing attention, maybe have a positive impact on their lives?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Like when I did the first story about Japan not being interested when I was at the Journal, I was writing from my desk in Japan. I was speaking to Japanese companies. The fact that we were putting across was that they're not interested in this project. But then again, it's an example of like, then I go to Alaska, and then even as a journalist, you see people whose livelihoods are tied to this. And so you don't even think about that when you're kind of, and I don't think Japanese companies are necessarily thinking either about the sort of local economic conditions in Nikiski, Alaska. But I mean, it does ultimately produce a more well-rounded story, ideally, when you go on this reporting trip. Like the story that came out of that was very much not like, this project's going to move forward, it's going to be great. I mean, I feel responsibility just as a human to kind of tell the stories of the people in Alaska who spoke a lot about the economic difficulties that they were having, but also this sort of glimmer of hope. And, conveying that voice, I think, is important. But the story itself ultimately was not like this project's going to move forward. It was like, this is a tough situation. People are hopeful. It seems doubtful that this will move forward, but this is what people are hoping for in Alaska. So I think, it is definitely difficult to sort of make sure that, because you feel somewhat attached as a human to like the people that you talk to, and making sure that you tell their story at least in the most truthful way that you can, in the most way that's most accurate to what they told you. Like that's the most we can do. We can't kind of forward their mission or really impact their lives in any way generally. That's what we kind of fight for, I suppose.
I want to get back to that lunch. And the fact that he said, "I hear you, sweetie," and kind of completely dismissed you as a person, as a journalist, and as a woman. And I feel like from what we've seen in the news, this has happened recently again in the newsroom, women journalists being kind of belittled and dismissed for what they're doing. How do you deal with situations like this where suddenly you're sitting there at lunch, you're just trying to get answers to your questions, you have facts with you, and you're just kind of being brushed off? Do you kind of keep pushing? Do you fight back? Is there like a fighting spirit that kind of grows inside that you're like, as a journalist, I need to get to the bottom of this. I don't care what he says. Or do you have like other approaches? Like, how do you deal with situations like that?
Yeah, that was an interesting moment. At the lunch, I was actually working with our intern at the Wall Street Journal at the time, who was also a young female.
Wow.
I remember when he said that to me, I looked over her and she just was like about to like crawl under the table. She's like, what is going on here?
Especially he's like the ambassador, right?
Yeah.
So a bit intimidating. He's like the representative of your country here in Japan, and maybe difficult to push back or say anything at that moment.
Yeah. I have never found really that like fighting with people is productive in those arenas. Like, we deal a lot of times with people that are angry about things that we write, or, even interactions that we have to have. But like in general, I find that if you just, as much as you can, remain calm and like listen to people and let them kind of vent, then eventually they'll tire themselves out and like reach a point where they're more calm and kind of understanding. So that's generally the route that I take. But with that story, and with a lot of stories, you kind of have to use that sort of anger that I felt at that moment as like fuel. That sounds like horribly generic, but like, in no world would we be like, okay, the ambassador is angry and he doesn't want us to write the story, so we're going to kill it. Then it's more just like, okay, well, this is what I'm hearing and this is what I'm going to write. You're going to be angry about it, but like, whatever, sweetie.
Are there moments when you do have to pull a story or stop writing on something? Or maybe during a story, you uncover some information that you are not allowed to include for maybe legal reasons and make public, but that it would have an impact on the story or the public's reaction to the story?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that you discover in the process of writing stories. And especially for, trying to think of a specific example. You discover things about like people's personal lives and, some of in some cases, like perhaps criminal activity that they did when they were in their younger years. And it's a discussion a lot of times with like our legal people internally of like, is this something we can include in a story? Especially if like the subject that you're writing about is not willing to work with you. So if you approach them for comment and they decline to comment or they don't respond to your messages, like they need to be given the opportunity to like fully understand what you're planning to write about them. And if they don't engage, that makes it pretty difficult. So then it becomes a kind of question of like, is this specific anecdote or detail relevant enough to the ultimate point of the story that it's worth including? Because, our job is not to go out and like ruin people's lives. So that's something we have to treat with a lot of sensitivity. Because, including kind of superfluous details about people's private lives or, what have it is not, that doesn't ultimately have any takeaway or the nut graph, as we say in journalism. If there's nothing tied to that in a specific thing, then, we'll often decide to kill certain details.
The work you do is primarily text-based. You gave the example of being in Alaska together with a photographer, but you also said earlier that there's more and more push of the publications for you to do like video journalism and such. How important is it to still do text-based journalism versus now what probably the majority of people consume are these videos from the papers' social media accounts?
It's absolutely wild. Like, I feel like I am one of the last generations who grew up learning specifically print journalism. And the Times is definitely putting a lot of effort into pivoting more towards video. There's a whole tab on the app now where you scroll almost like a feed of videos that are more curated. It's not like an algorithm that's feeding you this stuff, but we're definitely pivoting in that direction. Even yesterday, I did a story that was actually only for video. It's not even for text. So it's been a bit of a pivot for us who are like trained in the print journalism world to try and do more video. But yeah, I mean, it is really sad to me personally, just talking to younger generations and hearing from them that they'll listen, I mean, no offense to your podcast, they get information from podcasts and videos so much more than reading text. Which, I mean, it's just kind of the way things are moving and we have to adapt. But it does make me sad that, we don't have the kind of physical paper that we, thumb through.
Well, Japan, I think, I don't have the exact data, but I did read that they're still the country with the highest print newspaper readership.
Yeah.
But how different is it for you as a journalist if you want to bring a story as a video versus in writing? Is there one or the other where you can convey more information in less time? Or what are the pros and cons, so to say? And why is it important for you to continue with the print, the writing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, having done video stories and written stories, the process is so much different because a lot of times when you're out filming, like you put your statement out there and it's an hour of filming and you don't have time to go back and like edit. This is what I meant to say. So the process of like writing a physical piece, you have so much more room and time to like fact check and like go in and edit and perfect everything. Whereas like video is a lot more raw and like real in that way. So I think that is part of what is making it appealing. But like the level of kind of curation that goes into like a printed product that is edited through so many different processes. I mean, it feels like a different product. I mean, I'm not speaking for sort of the very kind of heavily worked on video pieces. It's more like our own internal video, but that is definitely different.
Do you feel that from a journalistic perspective, the fact that there's a push for more and more video at large across all news sources, and the fact that it's raw, it's in a moment, it's maybe less fact-checked, it's maybe less accurate, it's giving more hot takes, and that this is maybe diluting the value of journalism at large and the actual what it became popular for, the fact that there was research done, there was fact-checking done, there's an editor that proves everything, the words are chosen carefully to convey a specific meaning, and that this is kind of being lost in this kind of constant stream of video.
I mean, you get so many kind of proponents of this new wave of media, which is like videos and social media posts and, bloggers and, people say it's sort of democratizing news, and you have these kind of big institutions that are biased in their own ways, which, I'm sure we all have our own skews in some ways, but it feels like, the way I heard it described recently is like, yes, there's more kind of free news out there, but like you're being fed like fast food as opposed to like kind of more curated, whatever. And I think that's dangerous because, it costs money, obviously, to kind of, it helps fund our journalism and everything, but it's not cheap to get a news subscription to the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, New York Times. So a lot of the information that is accessible for free and being thrown out in droves is like not the most kind of ultimately curated news product. And I'm not sure people quite understand like the real importance on having an institution involved in it, because, you know, in some ways, I mean, it's great that there's more people out there spreading their take on certain issues, and it shouldn't all be coming from these kind of historic groups or whatever that are dictating how news is being covered. But the primacy that like I can vouch for that we hold at the New York Times and elsewhere in places I've worked on making sure that everything is fair, like having a standards team that goes through a story, having a legal team, having, you know, journalists that were trained on making sure that voices are evenly and fairly conveyed in a story. Like you just get a different product at the end than, you know, someone who's in a, you know, attic in Wisconsin and like putting forward their view, which is perfectly valid. But I think if people rely so heavily on like that kind of freely available deluge of information, that scares me, just in the sense that people will seek out sort of the news and the views that you know, match their own views anyway, and then we end up with more sort of polarization.
So journalism and opinion piece or opinion journalism is kind of being mixed together as well with those podcasts and political or social, economical commentators putting out videos on YouTube on a daily basis and just, this happened, this is what it means. But since it's still a developing story, probably a lot of elements are missing and not yet available to the public.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, that's why the Journal, the Times, we have a very clear wall between opinion pieces and news, to the extent that like we can't even share information with people from the opinion side. They have their own floor of our building in New York. There's like a very, because we don't want to, you know, have readers be confused of whether this is a news story or an opinion story. So yeah, I mean, it sucks to hear, honestly, as a journalist. There's such a kind of prominent view out there these days of like, oh, you know, the New York Times and the Journal, they're just, you know, they have their biases and they're, you know, not reporting what's real. And I mean, I can tell you, like, as a journalist in these organizations, like, I am trying my best to make sure that stories are fairly portrayed. I don't have an agenda. I don't have a viewpoint that I'm trying to shove out into the world. Like, my attention is on getting truthful, factful information out, and that's it.
So on the one side, there's this kind of endless game of social media where you need to get people's attention. You want people to see the content, eventually turn into subscribers. But as a journalist, mostly probably just get the information, get the facts. But then whatever goes viral, whatever grabs attention is not necessarily what the written piece would say. How do you keep the balance, and how does an institution like the Times kind of navigate this when they are being kind of accused of being one way or the other, not enough this, not enough that, and that these viewers are increasingly maybe turning more towards, so to say, or let's say, quote unquote, independent content creators or news coverage, and away from these legacy institutions?
Yeah, I mean, we are having to change the way that we do journalism as well. Like a lot more video. As I said earlier, we have a tab on the app now that is just video from different correspondents, which is something we've never had before, just over the past year. We're also writing shorter stories because I think we get kind of breakdowns of how far down our stories people make it. Mm-hmm. And clearly they don't have appetite as much as they did perhaps in the past for a 1,200 word story. They want something that's like 500, 600 words. So us as like staunchly print journalists from the past, you know, we want to make sure that all 1,200 words are used, because there's so many nuances in stories that you lose if you have to like stick to a short format. But at the same time, we have to make sure that people are still reading us and that we're not losing all these new generations to different forms of media.
Is there a risk perhaps even to get to a point where people just read headlines? It's just about they will read the YouTube title and thumbnail, they will read the journal's headline, they'll start the reel with whatever the text is there without actually going to the bottom of anything. And that is kind of making your work difficult as well, because then you, instead of working on getting the facts and sharing them, you spend your time dispelling misinformation in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I encounter people all the time who said, "Oh yeah, I saw that headline that you wrote." The headline, not the story. And actually, a lot of organizations, I think the Journal and Bloomberg both do this now, but there's a headline and then sort of AI generated captions that summarize basically the whole story in like 3 sentences at the top. And I wonder what that does for readers if they open the story and they're like, okay, I get it. I don't need to read the story. That worries me as well. Because, I mean, you just lose so much nuance in breaking down a story into bullet points. So, yeah, I hope that, there is some kind of revival in people, seeking out longer length stories and sticking to print. But I don't know.
Difficult.
Yeah.
There's one question that I had that I was curious about. What is the connection between the Japan Times and the New York Times? Are you working in tandem? I do recall having seen that the Japan Times is somewhat affiliated. How is the relationship between both of those?
We're not actually affiliated with them. They print some of our stories in like the physical paper. Yeah, Japan Times, I don't know all of the kind of details, but they will use Bloomberg stories. And then, New York Times stories, they'll kind of reprint it. So New York Times goes into their print edition. You see Bloomberg stories online on their webpage a lot. So I think there are those kind of ties, but we don't have like kind of,
I see, okay.
Yeah, direct newsroom ties or anything like that.
So where does that leave you in your career here as a journalist? You've kind of covered quite a few topics on a wide range of things. You said that you haven't really found the one thing that you want to kind of continue diving into, and each and every story gets interesting to you. So what are the things that you are wanting to work on now or maybe in the coming year or so?
Yeah, I mean, I've covered Japan for almost 8 years now as a journalist, and I keep thinking I'll hit a point where I'm like, okay, I get everything, like I understand, but especially in the Times position, there's been like so many new stories emerging that I'm like, last summer, for example, the big kind of election story was like rice prices in Japan, which were skyrocketing. So we took a trip up to Niigata and like spent a few days with some researchers who were trying to genetically modify Japan's favorite rice, koshihikari, to like be able to withstand extreme heat with climate change.
Wow.
And this is like a 10-year process where, they go on with microscopes and they're like quite literally like fiddling with rice DNA. So there's always new stories. And then we were back up in Niigata just a couple weeks ago reporting on the world's largest nuclear reactor that just restarted up there. We actually wrote the story and then it was online for about 6 hours and they shut it down again because there was a malfunction with it. And now it's restarted again. But clearly, I mean, people already were afraid of it being restarted and now that doesn't necessarily cause comfort. But yeah, I mean, there's constantly a new story emerging in Japan that's like fascinating. And in general, I think right now, Japan is probably peak interest of all the years that I've covered it in different organizations, with the rise of Takaichi, the first female prime minister, and all the waves that she's creating. I mean, she's only been in office like upward of 100 days, but already has caused massive fallout with China. So it's a fascinating moment. I mean, in terms of Japanese economy, in terms of the rise of the far-right parties in Japan. Yeah.
I'm very curious about that coverage, and maybe that could be one of our ways to kind of conclude this conversation. But when you cover a topic like politics in Japan, and you mentioned the election that just happened, Takaichi-san being reelected, her bet has paid off with the snap election she called. But one thing I noticed is the way this is being discussed internally and the way foreign media are portraying this are very different. And at the beginning of our conversation, you explained that the New York Times readership is primarily in the United States, maybe a little bit more left-leaning. So when you write your piece, do you have to choose vocabulary that responds to the readership so that they understand what you're referring to? For example, what conservative means in America might be different than what conservative means here in Japan. And so I've seen her being described as far right or conservative and like all over the spectrum, but factually speaking, it might be more nuanced. So how do you cover a story like this? How do you choose the right words to convey the meaning effectively to the readers by still staying true to what the situation is in the facts?
Yeah.
when the context is different?
Yeah, it is an interesting practice because, I mean, you find this a lot with sort of financial journalism. Is like it's very easy to rely on like these tropes or like jargon, for example, to throw into a story, and that works if you have like a very specific readership. But if you have, you know, your mom and pop in the U.S. reading a story, like they don't understand what the LDP is in Japan or how it's held power for almost all of Japanese post-war history.
7 decades. Huh?
Yeah. So you have to go a level deeper in order to understand something so deeply that you can explain it in very simple terms without losing as much nuance as you can. So yeah, I mean, conservatism is different in Japan. And yeah, I mean, we've seen in foreign media, I think, a lot this kind of reliance on these very specific parts of Takaichi, like, you know, she's a drummer, she's a biker, she is a firebrand, conservative, massive fan of fiscal spending.
The Japanese Margaret Thatcher, I've read that quite a lot.
A lot of that. But yeah, I mean, I think she is a much more nuanced character. I mean, even, you know, people are accusing her of being right-wing because of her comments made about China, or about Taiwan, rather, that has angered Beijing and caused this big kind of fallout and diplomatic spat between the countries. But, you know, what we wrote and the way that we covered it is sort of a bit more context around her remarks. Even, you know, she was asked a question by someone who knew she was going to say something like that because it was an opposition party member, and served his purpose to ask that question. And what she said was simply long-standing LDP policy. It's just, you can't say it publicly, and that's what her predecessors had stuck to. But I mean, even that context, you see her in more of kind of not as radical, perhaps, as she's portrayed in some media.
How do you know how much context you need to provide to the readers? How much additional information you need to give them so that they understand where the statement comes from or what this party actually means, historically speaking? Because you have a limited amount of words, so you can only put a certain amount of information in there. How do you choose what is relevant, what is not, what is enough for people to really understand?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the battle is just to like convey as much of that, especially historical context, in like a few paragraphs to catch people up broadly. And then we'll put links into stories for people so that they can click and like learn more if they want to delve deeper. But yeah, I mean, you can't write like an anthology on every movement in government. So, I mean, yeah, striking the balance between keeping word count relatively tight while also, yeah, not losing too much.
Is this an instance where now AI kind of comes into journalism and brings up a lot of questions about like the ethics of using it or not? You kind of gave the example of this 3-sentence blurb that summarizes an article, but the articles themselves, I want to believe they're all written by the journalism and represent the journalist's words, but it's inevitable, I imagine, that AI will come into the workflow somehow.
Yeah, I mean, we do use AI in our stories, and it is completely disrupting journalism in many senses. Like, you know, a lot of the kind of starter journalism jobs that you have where you're maybe reporting on company statements or compiling data and just doing short stories based off of that, that is replaceable by AI. Like, you get AI that can compile company reports across industries and come up with a story about what's happening in corporate Japan, for example. So it's changing the job of journalism in a sense that I think it is going to push people to all be more of the sort of investigative journalist types, because where we still have stake and like will not be replaced by AI is like our ability to go out and like talk to people and get information that is not publicly available online that can be like scraped by an AI bot. So like that human element is like where journalism will not be disrupted going forward. So I think we'll all be pushed more in that direction in a good way. But yeah, I mean, the New York Times has had its own issues with OpenAI and using our database of journalism to like train its own models. And so yeah, it's I think there are ways in which AI can make journalism better in general, but it's also a massive disruption.
So a lot of challenges ahead for journalism, for journalists as well, to kind of keep their craft and their ethics in order to provide the readers and the viewers as well stories and facts. Where does that leave you now? Are you excited for what's coming in the next few things? You said that there is an endless amount of stories in Japan, but journalism is changing. Papers are facing disruptions as well. We briefly talked about the Post off camera. But does that leave you excited for what's coming and what's ahead? Is it a challenge you want to take on?
I mean, speaking honestly, I'm not sure. Like, I feel very privileged and happy that, as I said earlier, like, I feel like I am amongst the last generations of people that maybe can say that they still have a job in the traditional sense of journalism, where you go out and you write a story in the print format. And, you know, that was its own craft for a long, long time. And I think that is going to completely change in the upcoming years. So I feel privileged to be at an organization that is still, you know, on its feet financially and still funding journalism. And thanks in large part to Wordle and the crossword. We're all aware of that. But yeah, I feel privileged to be in that position, and yeah, to still have kind of, I don't know what the next generations of journalists will encounter as they come into the workforce. And I mean, I try not to be like too much of a Luddite, but it does seem scary, the kind of disruptions that technology is going to bring. And I'm sure positives will be born from it too. But yeah, it feels like sort of the last breath in some ways.
Maybe something to keep investigating too.
Yeah.
The effects of AI on journalism and more. We covered so many topics today. Is there one topic that you would have liked to maybe bring up or get into that I didn't ask you about?
I think you did a fantastic job. As a journalist, I feel very uncomfortable being on this side of the question-answer cycle, but
well, thank you
that was
so
fantastic.
Much, for your time, your insights. That was super interesting to me. I had a great time. River Akira Davis, we'll make sure to have all your links in the description for people to go and find your stories. But maybe even better, they can buy the New York Times and they can kind of get the print version and enjoy it there. All the coverage of Japan. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Thank you.
It's so interesting to me. Maybe one of my favorites. Thank you for sticking with us all the way till the end. We really appreciate it. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the podcast. It helps us improve the show and bring you more in-depth conversations from Japan. Take care and see you next time.